Okay,
Okay.
so I'll do a screen share of my slides.
Okay.
Okay. Well, okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Rena, for inviting me to give this mini lecture. It is only intended to be a short introduction to space ethics, so I won't keep you too long at this end of what's probably been a busy day for all of you. But I am looking forward to some interaction and dialogue with members present after I've delivered my sort of prepared material. So let me introduce myself then. My name is Victor Cole. I'm a senior lecturer with the Centre for English Language Communication at NUS, which I rejoined a couple of years ago. I worked in another institution in Singapore for 3 years prior to rejoining, and I was with the Centre for Biomedical Ethics in our medical school for a couple of years prior to that. And I had an even longer stretch spent at CELC at NUS prior to joining the medical school. So I've been about a bit in the Singapore education scene for a while, and I guess I've developed my interest in space ethics over the last decade in particular. So I will give you a little bit more sort of personal background in terms of how I came to this topic area shortly. And let me just give you an outline to the talk itself before I say more. Okay, so the outline for today's short lecture is this. A little bit of a personal journey in the space ethics connection I'll sketch out for you shortly, what brought me to this subject area. Then I'll talk about space ethics as an area of inquiry, obviously a growing area of inquiry, more and more people kind of almost sort of piling in on this area to offer their expertise and to even develop policy positions on what should or should not be done in a space context, which I think, of course, is a key area of interest for your members. Then I'll talk about 3 types of ethical inquiry in the space domain, with some sample questions that arise in each of them. Policy formation for space ventures, which I think is kind of central to your members' interests. Practical ethical problems in space. Meta-ethical challenges in the space context, where we need to re-examine the grounding of our own normative ethical frameworks, and perhaps reconceptualize what we even mean by ethical analysis. So I think the space context is very interesting and challenging in terms of the array of different possibilities it opens for analysis and the application of existing ethical frameworks, but also in the way it actually challenges the foundations of ethics potentially as well in certain contexts, which we'll come to later. I'll also round off by saying a little bit about policy formation and trying to give a few tips for good practice in formulating policies to guide space ventures in particular. So a little bit about my personal interest in the space ethics connection. I guess my interest was originally in space rather than ethics. As a child of the 60s, I grew up in the Apollo era when the moon landings were in progress. You can see me standing next to a rocket engine, a NASA exhibition that was held in Singapore a few years ago at the Art Science Museum. But going much further back in time, when I first left high school, I worked at a place called the Royal Greenwich Observatory in Herstmonceux in the UK. And there's a picture of it there with 6 copper-plated domes, which contained, for their time anyway, very large telescopes, which were the cutting-edge equipment of that era in the 1950s through to the very early 80s when I worked at this facility. They were producing, kind of very high-quality images of the cosmos for that period. As you can tell from the cloudy skies, which are quite typical of that part of the world, the UK, not the most ideal viewing conditions. And we've had much better telescopes, I guess you could say, developed since, not least in the form of the Hubble Space Telescope and the James Webb Telescope much more recently. So this is no longer a functioning observatory. It's now a science centre with the telescope still intact for use by the public if they're interested on particular evenings to, to view the stars. They can still be put into use. My job was as a computer operator, so we were crunching the astronomical data that was being produced through those telescopes back in the early 1980s. So I was always interested in space, and I guess that particular facility had a notable connection to the Apollo program because it was used to map some of the potential landing sites on the moon when NASA was trying to decide where to touch down with Apollo 11. So in the years running up to that, this facility was producing very important analysis and data. So that was in my early years. Now leaping ahead 30 years in time to around 2010, 2011, I became involved as a lecturer at NUS with the Ideas and Exposition program, which is intended to be a writing module with a strong topical focus. For each of the modules within this larger program, there is a very specific topic focus, which is intended to facilitate interdisciplinary study, given that the students in the program, who are all resident in various of the colleges on that campus, are coming from different disciplines. So we've got arts students, science students, some lawyers, medical students, and so forth. So we need to be able to accommodate students coming from a variety of backgrounds who can still engage with a common topic area. So I thought that the space topic was about as broad as you can get in terms of accommodating students from different disciplines with different areas of inquiry for which there could be useful application for their disciplinary knowledge, but without requiring them to necessarily stay within their disciplines. My discipline at that time had really become philosophy because I was wrapping up my PhD in bioethics around the 2010-2011 mark when this program was first launched. And I also offered another module titled From Human to Post-Human, which is based on my doctoral work on radical human enhancement through genetic engineering. But I did, realize that there was plenty of scope for a module at the more advanced level, the second year level, where students had in those days to produce a 3,000-word research paper. That's been scaled back a little bit in recent times, so it's not quite as heavy going a project now. But I thought that there was good interdisciplinary potential there. And one of the reasons I realized that was because a few years prior, I was at a conference in Beijing, which was the 8th World Congress of Bioethics, which brought together ethicists from across the world, including, interestingly, to me anyway, 2 teams from the Russian and US space programs who were there to pick the assembled ethicist brains about the issues that they, as agencies, would face in sending a crewed mission to Mars, which was on the cards in those days, back in the early 2000s. The plans were, of course, put on hold because of the global financial crisis of 2008 and onwards. And now we're beginning to kind of revisit those plans more actively. But at that time, there was a very serious interest about going to Mars and thinking ahead about the issues that would be faced in doing so. So one of the key individuals at that conference was this gentleman, Dr. Paul Root-Wolpe, who had the very impressive title of first chief bioethicist at NASA, which impressed me greatly anyway. That was my sort of aspirational job, I suppose, then and now, to have such a grand sounding title and to be able to kind of connect philosophy and ethics in a meaningful way to space exploration. So he kind of switched me on to a whole array of different questions that they were looking at, particularly in relation to human health questions, sort of bioethical questions, in a very practical minded manner, and also with a view to kind of, interdisciplinary answers being provided to those questions. So there's a little video link there if you're interested to look it up after the lecture. He talks for about 6 minutes to camera about the nature of his work. So that for me was always a kind of inspiration for thinking about developing this particular module. So in terms of the nature of space ethics, I tried to break it down into 4 different domains of inquiry that I cover within the course materials for this module that I think also gives some sense of the arc that could be traced in looking at ethics in relation to going to space for various purposes. And so I used the analogy of a multi-stage rocket of the kind that the Apollo mission used to go to the moon to describe the possibilities to my students before I had them select their individual topics to work on. So I thought I'd share that with you as well to give you a little bit of a flavour of the possibilities. So the first question deals with venturing, kind of what reasons we'd have for going to space in the first place and what we should do when we get there, and indeed what we perhaps shouldn't do when we get there. So this would be connected very much to your area of interest in policy formation, but also looking at it through an ethical lens. The second stage, if you like, is once you've established your space itself in space, how to function successfully there in the most literal sense in terms of human biological functioning, both physiological and psychological functioning in space, and maybe also decision-making that has life and death implications. So particularly under emergency conditions when things might potentially go wrong in this obviously very hostile, extreme environment in space, what kinds of ethical questions then might arise and how should we tackle them? At a further stage, we might think about impacting the space environment itself, and then ethical questions arising of an environmental kind. And we might be required to think in a rather different frame about the nature of the space environment to how we might think about the environment of Earth and what our obligations towards it might be. And then finally, at the far end of this arc would be the possibility of colonizing or settling space in a more permanent sense. And that would bring to light, questions of a cultural and political kind, which again, obviously would take on ethical dimensions. So that for me was the full span of the possibilities that I thought this module could encompass. I guess today we'll probably be talking a bit more about 1 and 2 in terms of your particular interest, but I'll come back to that. This is an interesting entry point, actually, in terms of literature. If you haven't come across this text, it's available to NUS students through the NUS library because we subscribe to the Springer publications. So this is one from 2016 in which the co-editors Schwartz and Milligan make this important point that space ethics epitomizes interdisciplinarity, as I've already realized it did when I put my module together. Its contributors range from astrobiologists to science fiction authors, from geologists to philosophers, and from engineers to planetary scientists. So they recognize and they honor the expertise of all of these different types of professional that can, provide useful insights into, what we should or shouldn't do in a space environment, or even going to a space environment before we even get there. There are important ethical questions that need to be asked and answered. So my background, of course, is more in the philosophical realm. So I thought I'd just try and say something briefly about the connection between philosophy and ethics. And obviously some of these points are pretty well recognized, ethics being a subfield of philosophy. But also, of course, philosophers don't have a monopoly on doing ethics, as obviously Schwartz and Milligan recognize. There are many other important contributors to ethical debate and indeed to policy formation that come from other fields. However, in doing ethics, we do need to have some sense of value to reflect upon, the things that are valuable to us individually and collectively at a social level. And so something can be valued in itself. It can have intrinsic value, or of course, it can be valued for its instrumental value, what it can offer to other projects, etc. So we can think of values in both of those senses, and I'll come back to the nature of intrinsic value in a moment in the space context, because I think we are challenged to think differently about the way we ground our sense of value when going to space. So intrinsic value may be located in a variety of things. Excuse me, I'm a step too far. That we may encounter in our sort of space ethics inquiries. Ourselves, of course, as a source of value, but aliens, ecosystems, even barren planets may have some intrinsic value to them, but we need to be able to explicate exactly what that value is, what it consists in relation to qualities of those things in themselves. And I'll come back to that in a moment with some illustration. Okay, so one of the articles that I shared with my students this semester, and also in earlier semesters, because I thought it was a very insightful piece, which is an article by a British writer, Martin Fogg, titled "The Ethical Dimensions of Space Settlement," in which he looks at the ethical challenges of deciding whether or not we should proceed to terraform Mars. And so he looks at that question through a variety of different ethical lenses and raises questions about, whether it would be acceptable in relation to each. So breaking them down in turn, at the anthropocentric perspective, obviously, is a human-based one, and the intrinsic sort of value that we find in the anthropocentric relates to our rational capacity, our capacity for moral thought and action that would be recognized by the likes of Immanuel Kant, which is why I think Martin Fogg aligned this with Kant's categorical imperative, the obligation to see one another as human beings as ends in themselves and never merely as means to an end. He also considered animal life, perhaps extraterrestrial animal life, as having an intrinsic value. If it possesses consciousness, then a zoocentric ethic could apply. And so we could consider how our actions might impact not just ourselves, but animals, and consider them in any calculation of the consequences of our actions. So a principle of utility, he felt, captured that. And indeed, some utilitarian writers like Peter Singer have done likewise in recognizing that, the capacity for pain and suffering, and to the extent that it's possessed by animal species, is reason enough for us to consider them in our calculations about how we should behave. And then thirdly, ecocentric, the interests of an ecosphere, where all life is the basis of the value, and a principle of respect for life is what is underpinning that moral approach. And then finally, preservationism, where you've got something that has what the American environmental philosopher Holmes Rolston called formed integrity, something that has been produced through the various forces, physical forces of the universe and its evolution, and for that reason, may have some intrinsic value because of the way it's kind of come into existence. So the principle of the sanctity of existence is what underpins that. Now, Fogg realizes that in terms of Mars, the two middle categories don't seem to have any purchase, because we don't, at least at this point in time, believe that there are any other sort of alien species, whether sentient or otherwise, on Mars. So to the extent that they don't exist, he just then considers the anthropocentric and the preservationist ethics as candidates for dictating whether we should proceed to terraform Mars or not. He doesn't think that preservationism is particularly persuasive, and it actually runs against human interests. If we give too much credence to that position, then we constrain ourselves in going to space and doing all kinds of things in the first place. So he takes a much more anthropocentric ethical view to argue the case for terraforming, and also with the view that by terraforming we may be helping life to proliferate in other parts of the universe, which might actually then be supported by an ecocentric ethic that values life for its own sake. So there's an example of how one particular writer has had to think about how we actually ground value in the qualities of things that we might encounter in going to space, and then begins to reason on the basis of that understanding. Now, of course, it still remains arguable, and people would criticize Fogg for the position that he takes, but it does give a good sense, I think, of how we might try and locate intrinsic value in the qualities of the different things that we encounter. So there are three types of ethical inquiry now I just wanted to sketch out for you, which are the sorts of things that I'd have my students engage with in this course. they would ultimately have to select just a single topic to work on. So they would follow their interests here and just, come up with a single question related to probably one of these 3 areas of inquiry. Excuse me. Right. So the policy related questions that might be asked here in relation to space, I think all have kind of backward effects too. They have an implication for life on Earth as much as what you might also aspire to do in space. So there's a sort of binary element to them. So for example, if you're asking the question, what kinds of space missions should be publicly funded, you're not just concerned with why we might go to space and what we aspire to do when we get there and why that's important and might serve to justify the expenditure. You're also having to think about the opportunity cost of not spending that sum of money on alleviating problems on Earth, poverty, universal access to education, clean water, other things that we think are maybe even considered human rights, may be impacted by those decisions. So obviously this is something that's held in a kind of tension, that what we might prioritize in space might be at odds with what we might otherwise choose to prioritize on Earth. Questions about whether private companies should be allowed to mine space resources, which is something that's interested some of my students this semester, has implications for Earth too, in terms of, the riches that might be amassed in relatively few hands by allowing private companies to have free access to that resource, and then to make further use of it back on Earth. So what they bring back has implications too. Space tourism, how should it be regulated? Should we allow it to be kind of something of a free-for-all, or should we sort of treat it a bit more like the airline industry, where we try and establish safety standards and hold operators accountable to them? How should we view these space flight participants, those that engage, as fee-paying customers would become space tourists? Should they be regarded as something like adventurers who are assuming a certain kind of risk onto themselves and perhaps in the process, taking some of the liability away from the spaceflight operator, who can't absolutely guarantee their safety or guarantee it to the level that, say, an airline would aim to do and would be expected to do by airline regulators. So again, the implications here may have backwash effects for the way we operate our activities on Earth. Should we aim to terraform Mars? Well, I've already given you an example of how we might approach that question through different ethical lenses. But the very idea of going to Mars to kind of create a second Earth also has backwash implications in terms of whether we might, as a consequence, become less mindful to preserve the Earth, in its current condition, or to improve its current condition. So there's a kind of moral hazard lurking there. Some people feel, some environmentalists strongly feel, that there's a danger that we might become complacent about Earth when we think that we've been able to kind of spread our bets for the sake of our future species existence by creating a second home. And finally, as another example, I mean, this is an interesting question that one of my students is working on this semester. Should the disabled be considered for astronaut selection? Should we make a particular point of trying to recruit disabled people into a space program, or should we just look at their particular qualities as the mission criteria would seem to dictate they should possess, rather than make any gesture towards inclusivity for its own sake, and perhaps avoid any sort of virtue signaling through the action of actively trying to recruit disabled astronauts. Disabilities on Earth may become assets in space, and so the very notion of disability has to be questioned. And so, just as we talk about differently abled persons in a terrestrial context now and try and remove some of the stigma around the notion of disability, we might realize that there are some certain features of human physiology that are very much not well suited to the space environment, which includes having legs, because blood fluids tend to accumulate in the extremities in space, and so amputees might actually, in some senses, fare better in space and suffer fewer of the effects of being in a microgravity environment for longer than people that are fully limbed. So it raises all kinds of interesting questions, I think, that have backwash implications for how we might view disability more generally in a terrestrial context as well as in space. So these kinds of policy questions to me are interesting because they do require that sort of shuttling back and forth between the space context and the terrestrial one in the way that we formulate them. Into another domain, and this is one that I was hoping really more of my students would be bold enough to make a kind of venture into, and I think it's proved to be more challenging for them because I think it requires the exercising of some degree of imagination and the creation of particular scenarios in order to actually have meaningful discussion about the practical ethical questions that might arise in the course of space missions. So I've just got a few simple samples to share with you here. Should we, under some conditions, disregard orders from mission control and go rogue or mutiny when we're supposed to be following orders very closely as an astronaut crew? This semester, students watched the movie The Martian, and in that show, one of the crew members is stranded on Mars, and the remaining crew members rather mutiny against their mission controllers back on Earth and decide to return to rescue the astronaut, at obviously great risk to themselves. So the question becomes, on what basis should they, rightly decide to do that? It obviously means violating a principle of, obeying authority, fulfilling other kinds of duties that they have, and maybe even other mission priorities are violated in the attempt to rescue a single party. Obviously, that then requires some consensus building around everyone having the same view on returning to Mars to affect the rescue, as it has implications for their own health and well-being. Another such question could be, how should we sanction an astronaut who murders somebody on Mars? If an astronaut, for whatever reason, killed another astronaut, and yet they were part of a small, tight-knit team who relied upon one another for their very survival, what would you do to sanction them? You wouldn't obviously approve of their action. You'd have to some way signal that disapproval, punish them, as it were, to enact justice. But if you required their labour, their input to make the mission still viable, how would you go about doing that? How would you ensure that some kind of justice was done? Even though the law has a long reach, and you might say that the laws of the countries from which astronauts come when going to space follow them into space, and they would still be kind of held liable for their actions under, the American legal jurisdiction. The ability to actually enforce that would be absent. And so what kind of justice would be administered? It would be a difficult thing to decide upon. If we were in an emergency situation and we couldn't save everyone, then who should we save? This is an old chestnut that can crop up in all kinds of ethics discussions on Earth, but you could create very particular parameters in space, of course, in which that was the case. Would you prioritize, the mission commander, or would it depend on the skill sets of the individuals for the sake of the onward survival of the rest of the team as to who you saved? Or would there be other considerations? Should we ever euthanize a crew member who's in distress? You could suffer a very painful death in space. Should this be embraced as a possibility? Should people even have the means of self-terminating, committing suicide, indeed, if they were to meet with a particular kind of accident in space? So these sorts of questions would be very contextual. They'd be very much dependent on the parameters that were drawn. We might choose to draw some analogies with similar kinds of experiences humans have been through in extreme environments on Earth. So there might be former kind of sea voyages, the administration of frontier justice in the Wild West sense, when there's no marshal in town and the townspeople have to decide what to do with the offender. Lifeboat situations, so-called lifeboat ethics, which is a kind of niche area of emergency ethics, you could draw upon, or indeed, Antarctic expeditions or research stations based in places like that, where they're very much kind of cut off from the rest of humanity for long periods. Could they serve as analogies for how you should act? Probably not wholly. I think you'd still need to take very close account of the extraterrestrial context in which those problems arose in order to answer them. And you'd also need to be very attentive to exactly who the stakeholders were in that situation, who would be all of the affected parties by the decisions taken, which may include, of course, people back on Earth. And we need to be very mindful of the grounds of our judgments, whether we're going to act upon duties, consequences, virtues, rights, justice, or some combination of those things. And in teaching this course, I tend not to be a sort of philosophical purist about this, and allow students to be a bit more eclectic in the way they may combine insights from different ethical traditions, and maybe have a combination of things like duties and consequences in play in the way they actually work through the problems and arrive at a reasoned answer. So that's another area of application for ethical thinking. And then the third of them is really a more meta-ethical kind of area of inquiry when challenged by the extraterrestrial context, where we might realize that our ability to recognize value in alien things, alien species, materials, planetary environments, is still dependent very much on our terrestrial normative frameworks, and they may not, in many senses, be adequate to the task. We may not be able to recognize value that things possess in themselves because we are very differently natured to those other things. So the environmental philosopher Holmes Rolston wrote that alien planets and solar systems, excuse me, I'm just trying to move my screen around a little bit. Alien planets and solar systems do not have value points of view, only Earthlings do. But possibly we can learn to ask value questions in non-Earthbound ways and interpret what is happening on the planets as continued formative activity. So this is how he's beginning to kind of ground his notion of formed integrity, how things happen in space, even though we may not be around to watch them happening or causing them to happen. They happen through natural, through physical processes. And indeed, we ourselves came into being through those processes. So for him, this is a source of value, but one that may not be so easily perceived from earthbound perspectives. We may need to try and see outside of ourselves and the way in which we think about value. Now, if you actually encountered an extraterrestrial species that had the capacity for valuing in itself, the way in which it grounds its values may differ greatly from our own. And so we may need to contend with how aliens think about ethics when we're thinking about how we should behave to them. So I've got students working on some interesting topics in terms of the first encounter with alien species. Once we become aware of each other's presence in the universe, how should we then proceed to behave? Should we just simply leave them well alone, as Star Trek's Prime Directive might have us do, just retreat from any further involvement, or should we extend the hand of friendship or attempt to engage in an ethical manner with them, and yet not know how they might perceive us or what values they might possess? They might, of course, be quite hostile to us altogether, and we might be inviting our own extinction by even proceeding to maintain contact. So this is just an area in which students then have to grapple with how we think about ethical theories in the first place and what grounds our ethics, and how certain extraterrestrial contexts might pose challenges to that. So that's if you like, an arc that I've tried to sketch out for you in terms of thinking about ethics in space. I've just got a few final thoughts to leave you with in this lecture portion to do with policy formation, because I know that's what you're primarily interested in the space domain. The Oxford philosopher Jonathan Wolff recognizes limitations of philosophy in public policy formation, even though he wrote a book on philosophy in relation to public policy. He says, and quotes Bernard Williams, another Oxford philosopher now deceased, in making this point, that at least as far as applied moral and political philosophy is concerned, the important question is not what is the best form of society, but rather what is the best form of society we can get to, starting from here, from where we are now. So that was sort of Bernard Williams' kind of corrective to that more idealistic blue sky kind of policy thinking, which philosophers all too readily engage in because they have their own sort of favoured normative frameworks to draw upon, and can be perhaps blinded sometimes to the realities of how the world actually operates, and how maybe different ways of considering value also need to be entertained in forming policies. So this just leads me on to some final points about the means of making better policy altogether. I think we need to attend to the practical realities of the situation we're confronted with as best we can understand them, even though the space context challenges us to do that in many respects. There's a famous statement attributed to Tom Murray from the Hastings Center, the famous bioethics center in New York State, that good ethics begins with good facts. If you haven't got your facts straight to begin with, then the ethical analysis you do subsequently is going to be well off base, and it may lead obviously to quite undesirable outcomes in itself. And I would say that something similar applies in thinking about policy, that we have to be attendant to the practical realities of the situation we're dealing with, and not just think in sort of purely blue sky philosophical terms about how to address them. So the second piece of advice is then to beware of philosophers, and again drawing rather ironically on Woolf, who's sort of made his professional career as a philosopher out of a connection between philosophy and public policy, to recognise that philosophers don't have to compromise because they are under no pressure to agree to produce a practical outcome, which is the challenge to policymakers, isn't it? You know, to produce something that guides practice in a meaningful way. So philosophers are relieved of that responsibility, and therefore what they advise policymakers to do may not necessarily be the best advice ultimately. So my final piece of advice to you is this. I mean, don't just consult academics or academic textbooks if you're working in a sort of secondary sense in producing policy positions. If you're able to, and if you're particularly involved at the cutting edge of policy formation, in the way that think tanks and even one of my former places of employment, the Centre for Biomedical Ethics at NUS, does in making sort of policy positions available to the ultimate decision makers, the government, that you could establish mechanisms, things like citizen juries, in which a selective sample of members of society come together and are briefed about the nature of a particular area of concern. In one particular case, they looked at precision medicine and policy positions that they were considering developing around that, and run a jury system. You know, you actually get the participants to vote and to try and form a consensus around, you know, different policy positions that you are setting out for them to consider. Alternatively, there might be outreach and dialogue in a slightly more free-flowing form in public forums, but also in a more sort of structured sense, perhaps in focus groups, where the intention is not to generate consensus, but rather to solicit a range of different viewpoints from the public in order for the policy framers, those that are formulating policy, to consider whether to incorporate, you know, further perspectives in the way that they develop their policies. And of course, workshops could be run as well in furthering means of engagement of lay people in policy formation. Of course, open platforms on the internet could be another way of eliciting input from the public, just inviting people to give comments on draft policies as a way of kind of creating a repository of material which policymakers could then reflect upon. So all of those are practical measures that could be taken. I've given you a hyperlink there to an example of how citizen juries were run on precision medicine, as I mentioned, by my former colleagues at the Centre for Biomedical Ethics, which you might be interested to take a look at if you're not familiar with citizen juries and how they function. So those are my references that I've mentioned in the course of the lecture, and really it's over to you now for questions. And I don't know if I'll be able to necessarily provide satisfactory answers, but I'm happy to engage in some dialogue with you around the questions that you might have. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. That was a really informative lecture. So I guess I'll just start the ball rolling and I'll ask the first question.
Sure. Thanks, Rena.
Okay. So the first question is, how important is space ethics amid other activities? For example, the urgency to put people on the moon/Mars. Is it something to be debated on the ground or retrospectively?
I think it has to be debated on the ground, and it's something that has to be, you know, considered, in the course of those activities too, because I don't think you can, reasonably anticipate all of the ethical questions that you need to grapple with, from a terrestrial perspective. So going back to the arc that I was just trying to draw there, I think there are policy considerations about, how you propose to go to space, what sort of activities you might engage in while there that should rightfully be had before embarking on those ventures. But you can't, as my second element in that arc that I drew out demonstrates, I think, anticipate all eventualities. I think you also have to be prepared to do some work in thinking, through the issues that might present, in the course of a mission or a long-term venture in space, because, not everything is anticipatable. As much as ethicists, like myself and, NASA operatives might like to try and anticipate them, I think it's not reasonable to think that we always can. But to the extent that we can anticipate some of them, those kinds of questions, the kind of more practical ethical questions for how to act under certain circumstances in space, then again, we should. I mean, we should have discussions like this and perhaps even develop some protocols around how certain issues that could arise in the course of a mission should be addressed by a crew. So, it's something that you can begin to engage in, but I don't think you can exhaust all the possibilities of until things are underway either. So does that answer your question?
Who asked that question actually? Or maybe they're not here today. All right.
Yeah, I mean, there are important policy decisions to be taken about, going to space before we commit resources to it, for one thing anyway. I mean, there's so much capital investment and so much at stake in terms of, human lives, national prestige, even corporate prestige, I guess, reputational considerations about companies like SpaceX and what they're prepared to risk that have to be entertained. Some of these, of course, may be decisions that could be or discussions that could be had more within the context of an organizational structure, within NASA or within a corporation like SpaceX, but others that should rightly be had at more of a public level, and particularly where public resources are being leveraged as well. But even in those activities that may be more commercial in nature, we might feel that there's a wider sort of public or indeed human interest in weighing in on what's being done, if you like, in the name of humanity in space. It may be privately funded, but it's still, a human endeavor, to go to space and to impact on space environments and to attempt to extract resources and benefits from them and so forth. So just because something is privately funded doesn't necessarily absolve it of, oversight responsibilities from others. Indeed, there have been attempts to develop frameworks, to guide space operators, even in the private domain.
Okay, yeah. Does anyone want to ask their questions? Don't be shy.
Maybe you can ask for Joanna. Joanna wrote the first two questions.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so another one of Joanna's questions is in policy making, how do we balance creativity or being ethical versus being pragmatic, doing what works? Is doing what works that bad if we are in the process of testing? At what point do actions become justifiable?
There's a lot packed into that, isn't there?
There is.
Yeah, I mean, my quick response would be to say, there is such a thing as practical ethics, which is about sort of ethics at the chalk face, trying to decide what is the right thing to do within a particular context. So to arm oneself with the as it were, the intellectual means of addressing those questions, to become mindful of how we assign value to things. I mean, not necessarily in a pure philosophical sense, and you don't need to be a philosopher, obviously, in order to do this, but to have a sense of where we place value and why, and to be able to kind of justify that, I think is an important starting point for any consideration. Lay people, non-philosophers and non-academics and so forth need also, I think, to grapple with these kinds of issues. We do in our daily lives, don't we, as just human beings. If we like to think of ourselves as moral creatures, we're constantly challenged to do this in everyday life. And sometimes we may choose badly, and we may reflect upon that and realize that our decision making was less than ideal. I mean, we may learn important moral lessons from earlier mistakes that we've made in making choices, even though we may have made those choices in good faith, with good intention. So I think doing ethics effectively and is a reflexive process where you have to kind of think again about what you've done, look at the outcomes of your decision making and whether those were the best outcomes you could have attained, and whether you might choose differently, going forward, even under the same kinds of circumstances. So there's no sort of like cookie cutter answer to that question, I'm afraid. I mean, it's just something that has to be continually contended with. But I think there is something to be said for ethical mindedness. And I'm just engaging with some colleagues at the moment in talking about research within social, behavioural and educational domains, the SBER type of research, which is often given a somewhat lighter ride through ethical review processes by institutional review boards, because it unlike, say, medical research with human participants, it doesn't seem to have quite so much at stake in terms of potential harms to individuals. But of course, people can be harmed, reputationally and in terms of how people think about them by what we reveal about them in the course of our research. So some of the work that I've been looking at recently sort of emphasizes the importance of ethical mindedness in an ongoing sense of being kind of reflective about the decisions that we've made, and not trying to presume that we have all of the answers all at once, that we have to continue to think about the ethics of our practice even after we may have cleared IRB approval, institutional review board approval, for our research protocols, for example. That doesn't mean that everything that proceeds after that is necessarily going to be ethically acceptable. We have to kind of look at our practices, on the go, on the fly, as it were, too. And also go above and beyond what oversight bodies might require us to do as a kind of bare minimum to meet a kind of ethical threshold. But maybe that question was intended more for the policy formation.
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, I think policies also, although that we like to think of them as kind of definitive once drafted and approved and implemented, they're still open to review and revision, abandonment, I suppose, ultimately repeal, or kind of or violation by choice under some conditions. I don't think policy positions as laid out in particular kinds of documents that might guide practice exhaust our ethics either, do they? I mean, so I think as an ethicist, I have to kind of keep coming back to that view that as much as we want our policy framers, those that hand us the policies, to be mindful of ethical considerations at all stages in the process of that policy formation. And I gave you some examples of how they might engage a wider public in doing that, rather than just presuming to have the kind of ethical answers to the questions that they pose to themselves. We have to also accept there might be conditions under which the policies either, don't apply or shouldn't apply for other moral reasons. And I think the outer space context does provide perhaps, readier challenges to sort of policy prescriptions that we might come up with from the terrestrial perspective when we realise that our policies are not wholly fit for the space environment. Once we actually get there, there might be other contextual factors that need to also be considered. But yes, we want our policies to be ethical, to be ethically informed, but I think we don't want them to be the end of ethics or perceived as being the end of ethics either.
I have a follow-up question. Oh, sorry, where are you gonna go?
Go ahead,
Oh
go
yeah,
ahead.
I was, yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
So like
okay.
you mentioned, wait, who's going?
I wanted to ask a question because
Yeah.
like it kind of leads on from your ending remarks there about like a point where at which policy our ethical frameworks, our contemporaneous ethical frameworks on Earth may not necessarily be sufficient to meet the needs in space. And at this point, I really want to ask, like, what metrics should we really use when we are trying to balance different contemporaneous ethical frameworks with the concerns of a future goal of implementers?
Of future goal implementers. Are you just talking about sort of balancing competing considerations in the first case, really?
Yeah,
or-
balancing competing considerations.
Yeah. I mean, it's a rational process that you need to engage in, and a process of kind of openness and transparency. You know, in the formulation of your reasons for favouring, you know, a particular means of judging how something should or should not be done. For example, I mean, consequences and duties are often sort of separated out altogether, as of course for philosophical reasons. You can understand why that's the case, because you know they each serve as a foundation for a framework to follow after, don't they? I mean, you either ground your understanding in the importance of respecting people as ends in themselves and never merely as means to ends, in a kind of Kantian sense, regardless of the consequences of acting on those duties might produce, or you're like a utilitarian, you're attendant to the consequences regardless of other senses of duty. But of course the real world doesn't really quite operate in such a clean, pure way as that, does it, in separating out those kinds of considerations that they do need to oftentimes be brought together. So there may still be some overriding sense of duty that you're guided by, even while you're being attendant to consequences, at a more sort of immediate or sort of local level. That it's not a case of, it's not a zero-sum game between these kind of potentially competing ethical frameworks. And I think that's been reckoned with more readily, say, in biomedical ethics. Do we have anyone from medicine here or life sciences? No, mostly it's lawyers and political scientists from those domains, eh?
Yeah, I think like Shankai is a business student as well. So
Okay,
yeah.
Right. Of course, business ethics is another thing again, isn't it? But let's take the example then of biomedical ethics, something I'm, I guess, more familiar with because of my PhD being in bioethics. The fourth principle framework that was promulgated, by two American philosophers, Beecham and Childress, in the late 70s and up to the present day. In fact, there have been various kind of iterations of their landmark text, Principles of Biomedical Ethics, shows that there are, and they try and argue the case that these are principles that are kind of universally recognized across cultures, but that is still what open to dispute, and it has been disputed by other scholars, that you've got justice, or respect for autonomy, which, if you like, is respect for persons in the way that Kant would understand it, beneficence, the doing of good, and non-maleficence, the avoidance of the doing of harm, as four core principles in biomedical ethics. Now, these were originally developed for the guidance of biomedical research, when research participants were potentially at risk of being exploited by researchers based on various kind of historical cases from the US especially, but also from the World War II experience of the Nazis and their experiments, and what resulted from that in the form of the Nuremberg Code. And then beyond that, the Declaration of Helsinki, which was focused more on the obligations of researchers towards research participants, not just on the rights of the participants themselves, and then onward to the something called the Belmont Report, which laid the framework really for the principles of biomedical ethics. So those four principles are while they're upheld in their individual sense, are also weighed and balanced against each other because they can come into conflict. So they're regarded as what Beecham and Childress call prima facie duties, that in some instances, some practical every context of either doing biomedical research or engaging as a clinician with patients, one may need to give way or yield to another, but it doesn't disappear out of the picture altogether. It's just put on hold, it's suspended. So for example, beneficence might outweigh autonomy when the person who's been attended to by the doctor, may be judged to lack mental capacity to sort of express their will rationally, and therefore, the principle of beneficence kind of overshadows a concern with, doing what the patient wishes you to do. So there may be clear contextual factors that then provide a rational basis for choosing which of the duties to act upon. And obviously, weighing beneficence and non-maleficence, doing good and avoiding harm, you are thinking in a way which, may be aligned with consequentialist reasoning too. You having to think about future consequences, before acting, and predicting, the outcomes. So that framework, I think, has flexibility within it to consider multiple kind of moral imperatives, if you like, which of course can be taken as duties, but in a way that is flexible enough to allow for, the weighting of a particular duty against another when they may come into conflict. That's a bit of a long answer to a short question, isn't it? Does that help? So I think there are mechanisms for rationally working through situations in which there are competing considerations, and the principlist approach, emphasizes the importance of weighing and balancing, but how that weighing and balancing is actually conducted, is one of the challenging things about doing ethics, which is why we have ethics workshops, ethics classes for our doctors in training, and they have a 5-year longitudinal track of ethics running through their MBBS degree, to give them, further practice at reasoning through ethically challenging situations.
So, will you foresee future batches of astronauts having to undergo ethical training as well?
Yes, I would think so. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know. You raised a good point, David. I'm not sure the extent to which they're currently trained in ethical reasoning for the sake of their mission performance. Obviously, a great deal of attention is given to how astronauts are selected in the first place, and there was the concept of the so-called right stuff, wasn't there, applied in the early days of the American space program when the Mercury astronauts were selected. They were intended to possess the so-called right stuff, the right kind of character and qualities to be astronauts, and they were typically picked out the military and test pilot schools, because they had that kind of toughness of mind, resilience, and kind of strength of character, I suppose, that was deemed necessary for people that were operating in a very risky environment, which required, snap decision making and nerves of steel. As space programs evolved, and maybe the qualities and characteristics of the astronauts evolved along with them, and the selection criteria reflected that. So then we had civilian astronauts, people who are scientists but not test pilots and so forth, going into that domain, and maybe a different kind of set of qualities was valued in that sense. So again, there's thinking on the ground about how people are selected for performance on the job as an astronaut. But I think if you're preparing people for a long duration mission like to Mars, as indeed we are doing at the moment with various kind of long-term habitation experiments with people spending months on end or even more than a year in deserts, as a kind of like test environment to see how they fare psychologically and in terms of decision making. I mean, we need to be mindful of the challenges that those environments will present. But the problem also, of course, is not being able to adequately simulate in those simulations some of the problems that might occur. I mean, particularly in the sense of decision making under real, genuine, stressful circumstances, under real duress, life and death kind of decision making. It's difficult to put that to the test until the situation really presents itself. But in terms of thinking through certain protocols for dealing with, sick or injured astronauts, or how to prioritize under certain kinds of conditions, I'm sure that there would be training and workshops in that, and probably ethicists would have a field day in contributing to astronaut training. I think Paul Warpy's work, when he was the chief bioethicist at NASA, which he's no longer doing, he's no longer in that role, I believe, was really more thinking through issues about medical challenges in space, and maybe anticipating how we should respond to them in advance by provisioning spacecraft with certain kinds of equipment. What can you take to space with you that makes you able to deal with medical emergencies effectively? You can't take MRI machines, but you could probably take a handheld ultrasound, things like that. He talks about this in that video clip that I mentioned to you earlier, if you're interested in it. So some of those things are kind of anticipatable kinds of events that you could plan for, and there is an ethics behind them that you should obviously try and anticipate emergency situations, and what kinds of drugs and things should you take to space to mitigate people who are having psychological problems in space. Should you take something like a straitjacket to space and confine people's movements if they somehow lose their mind and threaten the safety of others? So those things need to be sort of thought through in advance, and so his work was very much focused on that. But person-to-person decision-making, that interpersonal kind of judgment about how to behave, is a difficult one. And maybe you could run workshops to train people to think through challenging situations and how they would prioritize and what the basis of their judgments would be in terms of the values that they would draw upon. I mean, individuals, when you ask them, might have quite different value systems, mightn't they? Do you want them to sort of share in a common value system as members of a single team?
Yeah.
Can you make them all consequentialists, or do they all have to be deontologists?
Actually, as a
descriptive.
Go
ahead.
Yeah. Like just a last question that I have. So I think you raised a very interesting point, which is the characteristics of space, that there is a significant entry barrier at the moment, at least, for participants to even enter into space. So to what extent should we really be concerned about the possibility that national entities can, in a sense, cherry pick the ethical frameworks that participants have when they go into space?
So I'm not quite sure I got the gist of the question. Is it about not being sort of overly prescriptive about sort of decision-making metrics that agencies might sort of impose on their personnel?
Kind of. Like how prescriptive should agencies be, given that they have so much control over even the kind of ethics that spacefarers can or should hold?
Yeah. I think they might like to or desire to be particularly prescriptive, from if you're taking your cues from NASA and at least the origins of the space program and how it's operated, with very sort of centralized kind of control and decision making. from the ground to space. I mean, you know, critical decisions have been taken on the ground, and particularly in incidents like on Apollo 13 when they nearly lost the mission. The rescue was essentially effected from the ground by providing, you know, instruction to the astronauts who expected them to kind of implement it. I don't think under those circumstances they were expected, you know, the astronauts to kind of make their own decisions about, you know, that particular kind of challenge. But going further forward, and you know, when there's time delay and lag in the radio transmission reaching the crew. I mean, you couldn't, if you wanted, even if you wanted to, be reliant wholly upon advice or instruction coming from Earth. You'd have to, you know, allow for decision making when there's a 10 or 15 minute time delay in the radio signal reaching Mars from Earth. So going further afield, I think you have to be willing to kind of cut the apron strings a little bit and facilitate and enable astronauts to be sort of more independent decision makers. I mean, you could have, I suppose, institutionally approved protocols and decision making metrics. You could train them in and require, if you like, that they follow. But you know, they, under certain conditions, they might very well choose to deviate. They might, you know, out of necessity need to do so. We can't always kind of anticipate what would cause that to occur. But as in the case of the film The Martian, which I thought was quite nicely illustrative of these types of challenges, you know, that the NASA, you know, utilitarian kind of preference, if you like, for saving as many lives as possible and not risking 6 lives to go back and rescue 1, and with, you know, with the spacecraft and all other sort of mission priorities at stake as well, was obviously at odds with the astronaut character's judgment about what their moral duty was to their crewmate, and perhaps also, you know, with a virtue kind of coming into the picture, thinking about the relevant virtues in that situation too, you know, virtues of things like, you know, loyalty and in terms of, you know, friendship obligations, and courage, you know, in risking your life to save another. So I think the justification for that decision among the crew in that fictional context, obviously, was that there was a kind of consensus view that they all agreed upon, risking their own life to save the one life. I think if there had been a dissenter, that would have been more complicated. I mean, it would seem then that their rights are being violated by the others that would override them just by force of number, and also in the face of the preferred decision-making metric that NASA was operating on. You know, the don't risk more lives to save 1. So that's maybe quite a nice illustration of the tension that could exist between, you know, the agency and the individuals, when the agency prefers something a little bit more sort of cold and calculating, perhaps a more utilitarian type of metric to be adopted, and individuals being moral creatures, probably highly moral creatures, actually, if you think about the astronauts being the best of us, if indeed they are, you know, when they're selected for those important missions to represent humanity, you know, you expect that they would be driven by strong senses of moral duty and obligation to one another. And maybe, you know, crew selectors and trainers for these kinds of missions need to be mindful of that as well, and not to readily default into a sort of simple kind of utilitarian calculus, and expect them to adopt that.
I see. Okay, thanks, Prof. I think that illustrates the.
Yeah. So it's not conclusive. It's not in any way definitive in terms of that important question. You know, about different decision-making metrics. You know, when they should apply, and you know, who should give way to whose when they come into kind of conflict with each other. But broadly speaking, you'd expect astronauts to kind of, you know, follow the guidance from the agencies that they're employed by, and the agencies would adopt frameworks that are respectful of their employees as human persons, you know, in the way that researchers are expected to respect, you know, research participants. It's not that necessarily astronauts are, you know, proxy kind of research participants, but I suppose in some senses you might see them in that vein too, mightn't you? That things are happening to them perhaps for the first time in human history, and they are, as in a way, proxies for, you know, learning that the mission controllers might be doing through that mission as well. You just have to hope that there would be sufficient kind of respect for all parties, you know, guiding decision making, that would, you know, prevent sort of clear violations or, you know, just overriding of individual autonomy. But in some instances, you know, individual autonomy does need to be overridden. If you've got a crew member that's gone berserk and is threatening the lives of others, they need to be restrained, don't they?
I guess I can ask my question, but Dr. Cole, I want to ask, how many more minutes are you willing to stay?
I'm okay for, you know, maybe up to another 10 minutes or so. Would that be okay?
Okay, yeah.
I don't need to keep you here if you have no more.
No, there are questions.
I'm happy to stay a bit longer.
Okay. Okay, all right, I'll ask mine. Considering mankind's role in degrading the environment here on Earth, can we be trusted to explore other planets and bodies?
Can we be trusted to? Yeah, there's that lurking concern, isn't there, that you know, we're just going to take our bad habits with us and repeat, you know, mistakes we've made in messing up other initially pristine alien environments where we encounter them. Does it mean that we shouldn't go to space until we've remediated all of the, you know, terrestrial problems environmentally? I don't think so. I think there is some justification for environmentalist concern around trying to, you know, hedge our bets, I suppose, and all too readily embrace the prospect of second Earth, you know. But I think in reality, I mean, Earth is our home, our primary home, and unless it's kind of somehow doomed by some other cataclysmic, probably cosmic, but possibly, you know, human-generated event, you know, most of us will be remaining here, and it will only be a relative few that would go to space in the first place. Should we prevent them from doing so for fear that they're going to destroy something else or repeat the mistakes that we've made with the Earth's environment? I don't think so. My personal view is that I would hope for better of humanity, and I think those that we send into space would be more likely the better of a part of us, you know, as a species, that through selection and, you know, careful selection, would be, I don't know, less inclined to do that. But I suppose once you've got commercial actors in space and profit is a motive, you know, that the risks multiply, that there will be actions taken that are purely sort of, I suppose, self-serving, so that their individual interests, maybe not the whole of humanity's interests either, but their particular interests at the expense of the environment, you know. And the environment maybe might be considered only valuable, you know, in anthropocentric terms, assuming that, you know, there's no, you know, life there that we encounter or could encounter. It still has value to us for other reasons too. I mean, for the sake of scientific inquiry, maybe to determine definitively whether life does exist there or ever did, so that we can learn more about the origins of the universe and ourselves in the process. You know, or for the objective appreciation too. I mean, the aesthetic appreciation of, you know, alien environments is one that, you know, appeals to some thinkers, certainly. It doesn't perhaps have quite as much hold or sway as some other anthropocentric views might on, you know, scientific value, for example, of those environments as an object of study. But nonetheless, I mean, it has some sway.
Yeah, because I also honestly don't think that we can stop other actors from exploring these other planets as well.
No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it seems to be in the nature of humanity, doesn't it, to go forth and explore. to be adventurers and risk takers, at our own expense, certainly. Whether because it may come at the expense of other things, we need to kind of put a brake on those parts of us, of our humanity that would do that, all too readily. There's still a question to engage with. I mean, where might governments step in to prevent private actors from going to Mars? Because they may have the wherewithal to do it, maybe even ahead of governments. With a company as powerful and well-resourced as SpaceX might be able to get to Mars. Say, let's for argument's sake, say ahead of NASA's. NASA's funding is somehow curtailed, because of the need to boost the defense budget in the wake of Ukraine, for example. And yet SpaceX still continues to make $1 and better resource itself. I mean, if Elon Musk was just going to go ahead with a personal plan to go there and build a habitat and live on Mars, as I think he just expressed an interest in doing, right? Should the government somehow step in and prevent him from doing that? There might be, stronger reasons for doing so when you think about it in terms of him getting it there ahead of the rest of us before we can, more carefully conduct a scientific survey of what may exist or have existed on Mars before he gets there and just starts. Let's for example say, building malls there or establishing a kind of substantial kind of human population on Mars. Yeah, I mean, that's a question to ask, isn't it? I guess I'm a bit more troubled by that one. If you think that individual, not as an official representative or emissary of humanity, but just as a kind of independent actor, could actually, in some sense, spoil things for the rest of us, in terms of what we might obtain in terms of scientific value.
Yeah, and also because space laws tend to focus on the nation rather than individuals or
they're more constraining of nation states, aren't they? The way the Outer Space Treaty was framed with sovereign claims being prohibited over space resources, but seemingly leaving open the gap for private actors and corporations to do that. Sorry, Henry.
Hi, Dr. Cole. I have a really quick question. I think maybe it was written by David on the Google Docs, but I wanted to ask about the meta-ethical challenges in space context and what you mentioned just now about how about developing a non-terrestrial perspective to think about ethical issues in space. But to me, I don't know if that's possible.
Is that a non-starter?
I'm very doubtful of such a project. So why did you mention this possibility? How do we break out of our anthropomorphic view?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the conclusion is, on closer analysis, if you're a student writing a paper on this, is that we can't. That it is just impossible to think outside of ourselves. We are, as it were, natured in a certain way, and although we can find empathy with other sentient creatures, and we can probably recognize value even in non-living entities like planetary surfaces. I mean, it's hard not to still perceive that through the anthropocentric view, isn't it? I mean, to truly value for the thing in itself and not because of the value that we derive from it as an object of study or just even of aesthetic appreciation is quite a challenge for the human mind to sort of wrap its head around. I mean, Holmes Rolston is an interesting philosopher to look at if you're interested. I gave the reference to his article. It's quite an old one now, from 1986, but he's still alive and still, philosophizing at the age of 89. That takes a more cosmological view on things, and obviously recognizes the different difficulties that we as humans would face in kind of thinking outside of ourselves, but still seems to think that there may be some possibility of doing that. I'm not sure, like you, Henry, that I'm convinced of that either. So I don't have an answer to it. I don't think it's an unworthy question to engage with if students are bold enough to kind of take it on, because it at least forces some reflection on the nature of our own ethics and just how difficult it can be to kind of step outside of ourselves or see things from a different perspective. And even just as human, in terms of human to human ethics, I mean, we're challenged to do that, aren't we? To sort of take the place of the other and see things from another person's perspective. And that's still within the anthropocentric realm altogether, to try and appreciate that there might be sources of value that we just cannot understand altogether is quite something. But if you think of the possibility of a much more highly evolved alien species that might almost exist on a different kind of substrate to us altogether, maybe some kind of, I don't know, hive mind, that's kind of connected, telepathically or whatever, that might even seem to defy some of the sort of biological laws that we understand. How can we understand, their means of operating from our perspective? It may be, just a logical impossibility to do that. It's the sort of thing that science fiction does better probably than, ethical, moral philosophy and, other kinds of academic inquiry. That tend to kind of reduce things back down to nothing. It's almost like a reductio ad absurdum kind of exercise in showing the kind of impossibility of a particular concept applying when you reduce it far enough. But science fiction writers are, obviously prepared to exercise their imaginations and trying to engage us imaginatively through that lens. And that's why I think Milligan and Schwartz, whom I began with, in that reference to their work, do find a place for science fiction writers to play in thinking about space ethics. And it's one of the challenges, isn't it? The challenge to the imagination to think out, truly outside the box in a different frame of reference altogether. And I think it's one of the reasons that students are a little bit loath to deal more with those contextual issues in space that I mentioned, the more practical ethical questions, than they are the sort of policy-based questions from the terrestrial perspective, looking forward to space, because they have to kind of contextualize it. They have to kind of create the parameters for the discussion to become meaningful. So yeah, it's a challenge to the imagination, isn't it? I mean, philosophers can engage in thought experiments, but sometimes I think even then they lack the imagination. So perhaps we need science fiction authors to assist us with creating a range of possibilities, to then apply a bit more kind of academic judgment to. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, ultimately. But I share your concern about the.
Yeah, I think I can. Yeah, I agree. I think the question is like, it pushes us to imagine something very far beyond ourselves. But yeah, I think that there's no easy answer to it, and it's really an exercise in imagination. I guess hopefully to challenge some of the assumptions that we have about ethics.
Yes. Yeah, there's quite an interesting text that a think tank policy writer, Seth Baum, B-A-U-M, wrote to do with the ethics of going to space. I think you find this article in the collection by Schwartz and Milligan, actually, where he's actually taken a consequentialist approach to thinking about whether to contact extraterrestrial intelligence. And he makes the argument, and it sounds like a kind of reductio kind of argument against utilitarianism, because he argues that if we recognize that they, as an intelligent species, have value, and that we as utilitarians need to maximize, this kind of value, i.e. the happiness that we can experience as thinking creatures in the universe, then if there is a situation in which it's kind of us and against them, we might have to give way to them. We may have to kind of self-destruct in order that the alien intelligence should survive and thrive, and greater utility or happiness is generated in the universe. And he doesn't have an easy way out of that corner that he's painted himself into logically, using the utilitarian framework of analysis. It seems to undo the utilitarian framework in a kind of reductio kind of sense, taking it to its absurd extreme, to show that we can will our own destruction. But it has its own kind of logic at the same time, which is maybe for some, it would be a flaw within the framework itself. For others, it may be the ultimate demonstration of the value of that framework, that we have to kind of seed the ground to something higher than ourselves if we truly value happiness in the universe,
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, it is. He struggles, I think, to make it entirely kind of plausible. It doesn't seem to me very clear why it becomes a sort of zero-sum game between us and the aliens, and why the universe isn't big enough to accommodate the both of us, But it's an interesting article to look at, and he's somebody that's working in the policy domain as a kind of private think tank kind of CEO or kind of co-founder of a think tank that advises policymakers on some of these issues. And he's done quite a bit of work in the space domain, but he does particularly favour the consequentialist framework of analysis and things like cost-benefit analysis in doing that, even though sometimes he tests the very limits of that framework to its extreme, to its breaking point even. So you might be interested to look at that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Cole.
You're welcome.
Does anyone else have any final burning questions?
I guess I can ask mine.
Okay.
Shankar?
So mine refers to space resources, something that you've mentioned in the lecture earlier. So it's commonly known that space is referred to as like the common heritage of mankind. Yet for those accessible space resources like those on Moon, that's finite. From an ethical viewpoint, right? Is it unfair for companies with no spacefaring capabilities, since they are unable to extract those resources? Should there be a redistribution of benefits gained by countries that are able to mine those resources to those countries that aren't able to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess my personal view on it is that, yes, I think there is a kind of moral reason that can be offered for them to do so, or be required to do so, in terms of it being a benefit that humans have acquired, and they could obviously further benefit wider humanity in the redistribution of it. The manner of the redistribution is another question. Just how much and in what sort of proportions, etc., it should be redistributed is perhaps too fine a grained question to answer here. But I think broadly speaking, you could very well make a moral case for the redistribution. And if you're going to make reference to the common heritage of mankind, or it being a kind of somehow a universal commons that is there to benefit humanity as a whole, then that sort of plays into that reasoning, albeit that not the whole of humanity has immediate access to that resource. I mean, just as not the whole of humanity has access to oil and gas, etc., but one would hope that from a moral standpoint that there was some redistribution of the benefits that are derived from that. And we're seeing the difficulties at the moment faced, haven't we, politically and morally, by one country that's at war with another controlling too much of the world's kind of supply of oil and gas, and the kind of moral quandary that's now placed many countries in that have had to choose almost against their own interests, particularly Germany, I think, that's quite heavily dependent, to about 40%, I think, on Russian gas supply, to surrender that, to take a moral stand against the actions that Russia's taking. So I thought we'd end up coming back to that at some point in the discussion as well. But in terms of too few parties having access or control over precious resources that could benefit humanity more widely, I think there is a strong case to make. I mean, it's the chickens have come home to roost as well for the Russian oligarchs that have been lauding it with their wealth for the last 3 decades, and now they themselves have become kind of pariahs, haven't they? Roman Abramovich kind of actually driven out of Europe and back to Russia, and it's quite seismic, really, what's happening at the moment. And there's got quite a few learning points, I'm sure, and inflection points there for humanity to take stock of. Maybe these crisis points do make it more apparent to us that in some sense we're all in it together. You know, if one particular country or party or individual even has got the means of destroying the planet at its fingertips, that is in no means a desirable thing in itself, is it? So things taken to their extremes, you know, in terms of individual liberties being given complete free rein over important resources, I think has very strong sort of moral questions associated with it. And I don't think you have to be some sort of, you know, Rawlsian or sort of left-leaning thinker, being concerned about original positions and so forth to necessarily kind of take up that concern.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Just my 2 cents worth, really. Like I said at the outset, I'm not presuming to kind of provide anything like a kind of definitive answer. Sometimes I have to question whether my own reasons for the positions I think I hold are actually adequately kind of justified, you know. But I think that's the nature of trying to be a kind of ethical thinker. It's you do have to continue to question the basis of your own judgment, don't you? And I think from my point of view, that's the kind of the key takeaway from a session such as this, really. It's that it's a reflexive and ongoing kind of process of self-questioning. It's not a case of trying to arrive at a kind of definitive endpoint, which I think is always a challenge for policymakers, not to sort of overprice their own you know, agenda or their ability to kind of generate, you know, a kind of alter the final policy position, because in some sense, whatever is final, you know, anything is open to question and possible future revision, isn't it?
Because like, yeah, different actors, different contexts to take into consideration. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I think we're living in a really interesting era for, you know, space venturing and activity, and these questions, you know, are going to loom larger, and there are going to be ever more questions. You know, we didn't anticipate the questions that would arise about cooperation in space between nation states failing so readily at, say, the International Space Station, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, with the threat of withdrawal of the ride home for the American astronaut potentially stranded there, or the resupply of the space station with what it needs to keep afloat, you know. And yet we know at the same time that there's a plan to crash the space station into the deep ocean, and about 9 years from now it's going to be decommissioned by being dumped into the Pacific Ocean somewhere called Point Nemo, which is something I'd not even heard of 3 or 4 weeks ago, until in the course of doing sort of further reading for my current module, I came across this spacecraft cemetery that they've been dumping hardware into since the 1960s, you know, which is a point in the South Pacific, pretty much as far away from civilization as you can get, which I guess is why they chose it, because they figured it would be safe to crash land spacecraft there. And that's the place they're intending to crash the ISS into when it's decommissioned. So that poses kind of environmental questions. And did they not think about the end state for the ISS when they first commissioned it? Should they not have done so? I mean, that's a pretty big piece of hardware that they're going to have to deposit into the ocean.
Yeah, I think it's like maybe because like they made this law or policy like a long time ago, and climate change wasn't that big of an issue. So I think they just like, it's like a path dependent thing. They just continue with it.
Yeah. I'm concerned about, you know, preserving the marine environment as well. I mean, there's another big concern that's loomed larger in recent years than probably did 30 years ago when they were first thinking about space stations. Yeah. Good. So, was it anything else I can help you with?
Does anyone have any other questions? Because I think that's all from me.
Sure. Okay. It's been a long session. It's kind of longer than probably you anticipated. Hope it wasn't too long-winded in trying to answer some of your very good questions, but actually, frankly, so good they're really very difficult to answer in any clear-cut and certainly definitive sense. So yeah, we continue to work through them, don't we? We'll work on these kinds of issues and hope that we can persuade others that we've, you know, thought about them carefully enough that the positions that we might come to are justifiable, at least for the time being. Let's put it that way.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Cole. It was
Most
very
welcome.
Thank you.
The Q&A session was really lively.
Okay,
It went
great.
on for so long.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion too. And you know, you, like the students I encounter in my regular classes, continue to kind of expand my mind, my consciousness about the possibilities of you know, how we might deal with ethical questions in a space context. Yeah, very, very rich territory to mine.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Cole.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks,
you.
Henry. Thanks, Shankai.
Bye.
Thanks, David. And thanks, Shanling.
Bye.
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 Okay, all the best.